I think we're live.
Oh, did we get the message? I didn't see it. There we are. Welcome to Dispatch Live. I am Kevin Williamson hosting tonight. We will have Mike, we will have Charlotte, we will have Grayson, and we will have Mary talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. So would you call this, is this rank punditry we're doing here in Dispatch-Ease, or are we just doing more sober-minded electoral analysis, Mike?
You know, a little column A, a little column B. I think that's the sort of balance I like to go for, at least, Kevin.
So, not naming any Ron DeSantis names, how many resets does a guy get? Is this like a cat with 9 lives? Is this like Richard Nixon coming back from the dead 11 times? Is this Joe Biden, who's been running for president off and on since 88? Is that right? Finally won one. DeSantis seems set for another reset, having cleared out some problem staff and also just cleared out some payroll because I guess he was burning through a whole lot of money and needing to free up some cash. What gives?
You know, it's a interesting question. I feel like, Kevin, we have talked about the DeSantis reset on a very recent Dispatch Live. So are we in the tail end of the continuing reset, or I should use the word that the DeSantis campaign likes to use, which is reload, a reload rather than a reset or a
That
reboot.
sounds more butch. Yeah,
exactly. Or is this a separate reset? It's really difficult to tell, and I think it's a bit of a problem. So the news today, reported by the Messenger, first is that the campaign manager for Ron DeSantis has been ousted, has been replaced by a different new campaign manager. Essentially, Ron DeSantis's current chief of staff in the official office in Tallahassee, in the official governor's office, now going to be running his campaign.
Wait, he didn't choose a Breitbart intern?
Did not, as far as I can tell. So this is
great.
you know,
so that seemed like a danger.
And to be honest, the people that we have talked to since this news came out have indicated that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of daylight, certainly not a lot of kind of fundamental difference between these two, the outgoing and incoming campaign manager. Doesn't seem to be any indication that this new one, Ottheimer is his last name, is any sort of is going to bring any kind of radical change to the way that the campaign was running.
Wouldn't you want some radical change around this point?
You would think so. And look, and let's be fair to Ron DeSantis, there has been some change, at least in operationally. Again, as we've been kind of joking,
it's been happening.
In this sort of month-long ongoing happening of a reset, we have seen cuts in staff and cuts to the payroll and to the budget. And a recognition that the DeSantis campaign was burning through cash more quickly than a campaign at its level should be doing. And you had
wouldn't the idea to bring the campaign up to the level of the cash burn rather than bring the cash burn down to the low level of your campaign? That doesn't seem like a winning strategy. You know, it's like, man, we're a really crappy baseball team. We should cut our payroll.
Right. Well, I guess if the problem is if you're spending more of that than what's coming in, maybe the first thing to do is to stop spending, which seems to be what they are doing, cutting back on spending. They also, again, did a sort of a change in their media strategy, in their communication strategy. We have seen a shift in that. We've seen multiple, what I would say is not echo chamber interviews that Ron DeSantis has given. He gave a couple of weeks ago to CNN. He spoke to CBS News, and he spoke to Brett Baier at Fox News, who I would consider to be a serious, sober-minded journalist asking, adversarial questions. So they have done that. They've made this change seemingly after all those other changes were made, in which I and our colleague David Drucker were told these changes were in place, and now it was time to kind of see that a sort of new operational approach, not so much a new strategy, maybe on the media, but not otherwise, to see that sort of help DeSantis get through the next stage of the campaign. And then this news came that they were changing campaign managers. The Messenger reporting suggested that there was some donor grief that the outgoing chief of staff was getting, and so this was sort of a maybe a sop to donors who were grumbling and saying, we need to see a change all the way at the top. But again, everything that we've heard since this news broke this morning from our sources suggests that it's sort of like moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. Maybe that's a little drastic. Maybe Ron DeSantis's campaign isn't sinking into the North Atlantic after hitting an iceberg named Donald Trump. But that seems to be, this seems to sort of be, again, a kind of aesthetic or a surface level change. Doesn't really change the underlying strategy. And Kevin, that strategy really hasn't been working so far for Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, it's hard to think of Trump as an iceberg, although I could think of several other things that float. That would be a good
look.
comparison.
I didn't say it was a perfect metaphor. Don't hold me to that.
Yeah. So I guess the next big thing in the campaign that'll be the I guess moment of truth for some people be the debate.
Yes.
And so if I'm Ron DeSantis, if I'm the DeSantis campaign and I can't fire DeSantis and get a new candidate, and the best you can do is to fire your manager and stay with the same candidate, what needs to happen at the debate to turn things around for me?
Yeah, I having talked many times with campaigns and aides and advisors, they really sometimes just wish they could fire the candidate, and you just can't do that. Look, I think Ron DeSantis has a task that's not now that different from many of the other challengers to Donald Trump. He's got to prove that he belongs up there. He's got to prove that he deserves the nomination and deserves to take it from the frontrunner, Donald Trump. There's still a question of whether Trump is going to show up. We know that there's been some reporting that Trump is being courted by Fox News. Fox News is hosting, we should say, this August 23rd debate in Milwaukee. They obviously want Donald Trump to be there. He's the front runner, obviously good for ratings, but of course it's good for the debate as well. He's debating his rivals. The question Trump is asking himself is it good for him to show up there? But look, Ron DeSantis is challenging Donald Trump. He is the closest at this point challenger to Trump. I hear this a lot, by the way, from DeSantis folks is, DeSantis may be struggling, but all the other candidates would rather be in DeSantis's position than the one they're in right now. So he's got to take advantage of that. He's got to get some blows against Donald Trump that land and that are effective. Does that mean going a little harder on some of these indictments? This is a sticky situation, but you started to see Ron DeSantis in his messaging, point out that he thinks that this is a problem for Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is a flawed candidate because of these legal troubles that he's facing. So will he kind of go all the way and really make the sort of case that he ought to make? That's a question.
Part of me doesn't see why it has to be so sticky. I mean, granted, I'm not a political speechwriter. I don't advise these guys, but I don't see why you can't go out and say, okay, this New York case, I'm not sure if it was a crime when he bribed the porn star to keep quiet about the adultery, or if it wasn't a crime when he bribed the porn star to keep quiet about the adultery. But maybe the problem is bribing the porn star to keep quiet about the adultery.
You would think that would be a pretty simple, non-sticky situation, but
it seems like a line that writes itself.
But you do have to consider this, Kevin, which is we have some information siloing going on in this country, and a large number, and polling bears this out, recent polling, in fact, shows a large number of people in this country, and most of them are Republicans. It's not all Republicans, but as a large number of Republican voters and Republican primary voters simply don't believe that Donald Trump did anything wrong, that some of them don't believe that even some specific facts of some of these cases, for instance, the Mar-a-Lago classified documents, this is a fact. This is a verified fact that Donald Trump had documents that were classified that he should not have had. And there is polling that suggests a sizable number of Republican voters don't believe that he had the documents. So when you're dealing with this, and you're dealing with another factor, which is something maybe I've spoken about before on Dispatch Live, but it's something I've definitely batted around the office before, which is Donald Trump is not only a candidate for president in the Republican primary, he's also an issue on which Republican voters, a large number of Republican voters feel very strongly about, in favor of. That is really what makes it sticky. I think a lot of these Republican candidates feel like, I've got to run against Trump, but I can't be seen as being against Trump. That makes no sense to me. Why are you running against him for the nomination if you're not willing to run against him? But that's the political calculation they've made. They're not entirely wrong about the way Republican primary voters think about Donald Trump. That just shows, again, sticky is the best way to describe it. It's a sticky situation if you want to be the leading candidate, the head of this party, when Donald Trump is still around.
Yeah. Well, after Donald Trump and testicular cancer, my favorite thing to think about is Mike Pence. Does Pence matter? Do we still have to talk about Mike Pence? I understand he qualified for the debate, so good for him. He'll be up on the stage with that very unbearable, insufferable face of his. And what about Mike Pence? Where is he? What's happening?
Well, I'll soothe you, Kevin, as clearly a huge Mike Pence fan. I'll soothe you to know he does remain relevant in this, but it's not necessarily for the reason that Pence and his campaign would like. But the simple fact is that he is a major factor in, of course, the latest indictment and the latest case that the feds have brought. He is a fact witness. He is in the run-up to January 6th, and all of the discussions that are laid out in the indictment and the charges that the feds are making against Donald Trump, Mike Pence plays an important supporting role in that. And he was a part of the scheme that John Eastman and a number of the people around Donald Trump had concocted in order to essentially pause the electoral count, the counting of the vote on January 6th, and this scheme to send those votes back to the states. Pence, of course, said, no, I don't have that power. You can't send these votes back to the states. But there are these discussions. We've heard about them in news reporting. They're now in this indictment that Pence and Trump had. It's very possible that Mike Pence could be called as a witness in a trial. So he may be sort of circling the drain polling wise or chance wise for the Republican primary or for the Republican nomination. But as long as he's in the primary race, and especially now that he's on the debate stage, it's going to be interesting. He has something to talk about, and he is leaning into it much more. Mike Pence giving interviews in the last week since the indictment came out, defending his position, criticizing Donald Trump's, these are his words, crackpot lawyers. I mean, for Mike Pence, those are some pretty stark words from a otherwise staid guy. So he's found himself relevant despite maybe his own inability to make himself relevant. The indictment has certainly done that.
Yeah, I think he got permission to call them crackpot lawyers from the coverage that suggests that Trump thought they were crackpot lawyers too. At least, I mean, apparently, I think Sidney Powell was coming in talking all this crazy talk, and Trump's don't know about that.
A little crazy even for Trump.
Little crazy even for Trump. Well, that's a good place to wrap things up, I guess. Anything else we haven't talked about that we should add or think about? We did have some questions that I didn't get a chance to get to, but they're mostly too depressing to think about, like, will anything ever break the spell of Trump over the Republican Party? Some of the other questions are things we're going to get to with some of the other folks.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, talk about?
No, we'll be talking about this for a long time. So stay tuned is all I have to say.
Okay, we have Charlotte up next. Is Charlotte on deck?
Hello, how are you?
Hey, Charlotte, what's going on?
Not much. I'm back stateside for the moment.
Do you have a very small apartment?
No, I'm actually staying with my grandparents. It's just been a tour of the Southeast since I've been back in Georgia right now.
Whereabouts in Georgia are you? I like Georgia.
St. Simon's Island.
Oh, very cool. Very nice. Much less nice place, at least at the moment, is Niger. Do you want to give us a rundown on what's been going on there before we talk about it? And also tell us a little bit about the organization. I don't know if they pronounce it ECOWAS or if they pronounce it by the letters, but who is a factor in this?
Yeah, of course. So I have a piece on the site today that kind of digs into this in greater detail, but late last month, soldiers basically imprisoned Niger's democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum. They put him under house arrest. He remains under house arrest and declared themselves the country's leaders. They gave a number of reasons for overthrowing the government. They cited misgovernance, a deteriorating security situation, but as with all coups, there was definitely a degree of self-interest involved.
Complaints about the security situation specifically had to do with jihadist insurgents?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that was cited, but it's actually interesting because jihadism in Niger has kind of been more dealt with relative to other countries in the Sahel region. The two countries who are most plagued with jihadist violence in the region are Mali and Burkina Faso, and those are actually both led by coup governments as well. So they gave all of these reasons, but the leader of the coup, General Omar Chiani, was actually about to be fired from his position as head of the presidential guards. So they did all of the usual coup stuff. They instituted a curfew. They closed off borders. And
they named a new prime minister?
Not that I'm aware of. I think Chiani has kind of designated himself the president for the moment.
I think the guy's name is Zane.
Zane. Okay.
I'm sorry. Didn't mean to spring something on anything. It's relatively recent development.
Good to know. That's interesting. But it's interesting that they haven't reinstalled the president Bazoum for the reason you mentioned. ECOWAS is a West African bloc of which Niger was actually a member until they were suspended after the coup. But they threatened Niger with essentially military action if the democratically elected government wasn't reinstalled. So
do they have the capacity to really enforce that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it hasn't been their traditional role in the past. I think they've kept residual peacekeeping forces since the 90s. So it could potentially be a function of ECOWAS. Its most powerful member, Nigeria, actually has a pretty formidable army. So it's definitely not out of the question, but there's been a lot of mounting dissent within Nigeria about a military intervention. It borders Niger, and a lot of people have ethnic and familial ties with Niger, and they don't like the prospect of an actual attack. So basically, this body ECOWAS told Niger, the coup, the junta, that they had 1 week to reinstall President Bazoum. They did not reinstall President Bazoum. The deadline passed on Sunday. So right now, the prospect of an actual West Africa-wide war involving ECOWAS and Niger has gone down a little bit because they didn't follow through with their threat. But for the moment, it seems like the coup is really it's digging in, and the junta is kind of establishing their place in Niger.
Yeah, so maybe let's expand a little bit on the issue of the possibility of a larger regional conflict. So you said they were sort of tamping things down for the moment, but of course, ECOWAS isn't the only actor in that part of the world. There are the people who are there, institutions and countries that can intervene. Are we, or should we be concerned about this turning from an internal Nigerian matter into something that is wider?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. After ECOWAS issued its ultimatum to Niger, demanding that they reinstate the president or face the consequences, Niger's two neighbors, Mali and Burkina Faso, which I mentioned, are both under coup governance, basically said that they would consider any attack on Niger an attack on their countries. So it was starting to look like it might spiral into a sort of multinational West African war, which would have pretty far-reaching consequences. At the moment, it looks like ECOWAS isn't going to follow through with its threat of military intervention. They have.
And Mali and Burkina Faso argued that because their coup governments have relationships with the one in Niger, or because they just want to not have that precedent established, or what's their investment in defending the coup? The coup plotters kind of like to stick together.
Yeah, I think that's essentially it. If they're seeing military intervention for the sake of reinstating democratic governments, that's a concerning trend. And one of the reasons ECOWAS, the West African bloc, has come down so forcefully on this issue is because Mali and Burkina Faso were both member states, and their membership was also suspended over coups. So once you have 3 subsequent democratic governments being overturned by these military regimes, it kind of starts to set a really dangerous precedent for this bloc that considers itself to be governed by democratically elected governments. So you can see it happening to Niger. It might happen to another member state soon, and I think that's the concern.
And what's the American interest here?
That's a good question. There are a few. I mean, I think first and foremost, Niger has been our main ally in the region for combating jihadism. I think it's pretty underappreciated how serious the terrorist threat emanating out of the Sahel region is. There was a global terrorism index report last year that found that 43% of all deaths due to terrorism were all concentrated in the Sahel. So for context, that's more than the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa combined.
Is that just a result of sort of state dysfunction and low levels of state capacity and poverty and the usual things, or is there something specific about this area?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, as the war on terror kind of pushed groups out of Syria and Iraq and what you think of the traditional global hotbeds of terrorism, a lot of these groups and ideologies kind of migrated into the Sahel region. But 73% of the deaths due to terrorism in the region are in Mali and Burkina Faso. So you can really see the direct impact that having a military-run, anti-democratic regime at the helm of the country has when it comes to countering insurgencies.
Gotcha. The United States has troops in Niger, do we not?
Yes, we have about 1,100 troops there, and France has about 1,500 troops there. And that, along with a U.S. drone base, have been really crucial in countering jihadism in the country. So the concern is that if we have to cease military cooperation with Niger, if we have to pull these military assets out of the country, that we'll no longer have an anchor to basically combat terrorism in the Sahel, but also stop the spread of terrorism south to other countries on the continent.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well confirmed these reports are, but there's talk of Wagner Group mercenaries there now. So you've got sort of Russian proxies operating there, and Americans and French troops all in the same relatively small and narrow theater. Does this raise the possibility of a conflict that is only incidentally about Niger?
That's a good question. From what I'm hearing at the moment, the Wagner Group presence is pretty residual. But I think the US is probably going to take a pretty tough stance that if Wagner is in any way involved in the conflict, then the military cooperation with Niger is over. I think that would be an absolute red line. But it's interesting, like I mentioned before, Burkina Faso and Mali, Niger's neighbors, also had coups. And immediately after the coups, they essentially invited in the Wagner Group. And you've really seen like the immediate disastrous impact on that, on the civilian population. I think in Mali, since Wagner entered the country, civilian deaths have gone up 280%. And it's definitely not a coincidence.
Violence or from other sources? I mean, because they're basically pirates, right? I mean, they steal in addition to fighting.
Yeah, they steal and they indiscriminately kill civilians. And not only do they do that, but they train militaries to do the same. So Wagner's worked pretty closely with Mali's military and kind of taught them these tactics. So I think inviting Wagner in would definitely be disastrous for Niger's civilian population. And then it would just give Russia and the mercenary group another foothold in the region.
I suppose the question then is, how much does the coup government really care about the civilian population?
Yeah, I think judging on what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, not much.
Not much. See if we have any questions to go with this. One of our readers would like to know, what is the most important thing that you think the Biden administration can do to keep Russian and Chinese influence there to a minimum? You mentioned, certain red lines. As I recall, Joe Biden served in a different administration that talked a lot about red lines in Syria and did, if I recall, nothing was the response.
Yeah, I think it's tough because, Wagner Group involvement and cooperation with Niger's junta would definitely be a red line. It would lead to the end of U.S. security cooperation with.
They talk that way, but there's a certain kind of inertia in these affairs sometimes.
Yeah, and I think part of the ambiguity is definitely strategic, because if the U.S. does completely cut off military cooperation with the country, that's essentially creating a vacuum for Wagner and other bad actors to exploit. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think the best thing the U.S. could do at this point would be, kind of throwing its backing behind its other partners in the region, particularly ECOWAS and Nigeria, and taking a really hard line and trying to push Niger back to some sort of civilian governance. I don't think that necessarily has to require military intervention. Niger it's landlocked, it's relatively young, impoverished. I think that there are a lot of political and economic pressure points at its neighbors' disposals. I mean, Nigeria provides 70% of the country's electricity.
And do we think the Nigerians are inclined to use that pressure?
It's unclear. I think the president is definitely trying to take a really hard line. But like I mentioned, there's a lot of division within the country just because of its historical ties with Niger. So time will tell whether or not ECOWAS is actually able to effect some sort of regime change in the country and try to restore democracy.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. I enjoyed reading the piece, and I recommend it to anyone who hasn't looked at it yet. There's some very interesting insights in there. Talk to you again soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Grayson, I believe, is up now.
Hello.
Hey, Grayson.
How's it going?
Yeah, no complaints in particular. Ready to go?
Yeah, let's get into it.
What is a Devon Archer and why should I care about his testimony?
That's a great question. Well, Devon Archer happens to be the one-time business partner of a certain president's son, who had some interesting things to say in a closed session with some lawmakers last Monday, I believe, that turned into an open session when the transcript was released, so everybody could have their obviously nuanced and balanced takes on this issue.
As this story tends to really bring out the nuance and sobriety in people.
Obviously, I think we have a pattern here when it comes to these House investigations into Hunter Biden and new releases of information or new documents that basically constitute a Jackson Pollock when it comes to how you can interpret it. One side says this completely absolves the president. The other side says this basically says there was a pay-for-play influence peddling scheme. And obviously the truth is somewhere between those two poles. But what Archer's
Jackson Pollock painting as being like a Rorschach test?
Could be. Yeah.
Okay. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't want to run off on a sideline about here, but I've never really thought of them that way. Have you ever read The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe? You should read it. Okay. Back to Hunter Biden now.
No, yeah, I'll add that to the reading list. Basically what his testimony illustrated was that what people had kind of already known already based off of previous results of the investigations was that Hunter Biden was pretty heavily playing off of his dad's name to his own personal benefit. The one of the most well circulated lines of testimony was the brand, or the quote unquote Biden brand, that Hunter was representing, which was the family name, the family influence, family access to Washington. So Archer very much affirmed that that was a part of the business pitch that him and Hunter were making to investors and companies that were working with their advisory firm. But at the same time, he also very clearly and directly emphasized that none of Joe Biden's contact with Hunter Biden was related to business interests in an explicit manner. He didn't talk about it with Hunter Biden. There was no promises made by Hunter Biden that Joe Biden acted upon. So those were kind of the two themes of his testimony. What was new, or perhaps most revelatory, were phone calls and meetings. So throughout their roughly 10-year or so partnership, Joe Biden would talk to his son essentially every day, particularly as his brother, Beau Biden, was dealing with cancer. And some of those phone calls, just I think he said around 20 of them, Hunter Biden would be in a business meeting setting and he would put his dad on speakerphone. And it would kind of be like, hey, like I'm here with so-and-so meeting about such and such. It's unclear how many of those phone calls Joe Biden knew exactly who was in the conversation with him on speakerphone. But Archer said that business wasn't discussed when those calls were taken by Hunter, that it was basically just niceties, talking about where you were, where he was traveling at the time, the weather, et cetera. And there were a couple of dinners that Joe Biden attended with similar business contexts also present at those dinners where business wasn't discussed, but he kind of made an appearance. So that's kind of...
You know a lot of men in their 40s and 50s who talk to their parents every day?
I don't know. I do not know that many men who do that. So that's maybe one suspicious reason there. I don't know.
It's a very close family.
Yes. Yeah.
So Biden shows up at a lot of things where there are people they're in business with, but business doesn't get discussed. Let's go ahead and hang and allegedly on the end of that, but at least according to this testimony. Just to dial it back for just a second.
Yeah.
The advisory firm these two guys operated, what did it do? I mean, what was the service they allegedly offered? Did they advertise themselves as fixers, essentially, or what was their notional business?
Their notional business was providing a knowledge of Washington and the workings of Washington to international partners. And obviously that would vary based off of the business that they were partnering with, what that would look like. But what Archer described in his testimony was that kind of broad bucket of, we understand how Washington works. If for whatever reason your international business interests intersect with some of those issues, we could provide you with advice on that. It's pretty vague in the testimony. It didn't get too much into the details of what you are actually doing on a practical basis for these companies. One potential issue that House Republicans have raised is whether or not Hunter Biden committed any FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act violations, because there are certain rules if you are actually taking lobbying actions that are explicitly working with lawmakers and other members of the government on behalf of a party in an explicit way. You have to disclose that. Archer's testimony didn't indicate that any of that happened. There were portions of the interview where he said that Hunter was very aware of the issue with FARA and was very much wanting to make sure that they weren't running afoul of any of those rules. You can kind of take that for what it is, but that's the extent of the business lines that was discussed at the hearing.
I imagine he had some reason to want to minimize that, because presumably he would be liable for the same sorts of prosecution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there were some emails between Hunter and Archer that were disclosed as part of when the transcript was disclosed as well. And it makes really clear that Hunter was at least according to what's clear in the email, was definitely trying to sell this idea that there was a causal or perhaps causal relationship between things that his father was doing, certain trips that he was taking, and the actions that the advisory firm was doing. But at the exact same time, in the same emails, he's very worried about setting that expectation, because presumably there was no real causality between those two. Mm-hmm. So it's this balance and this tension that came through in Archer's testimony.
So the best interpretation, then, the most generous interpretation to Hunter Biden, is that he's a profoundly dishonest rainmaker.
One could say that, yeah. I think that, again, adding the caveat of assuming this is all accurate, we should know Archer got testified under an immunity agreement in the investigation, the Delaware investigation into Hunter Biden. And he, I think, will be reporting to prison sometime in the next however long over fraud charges, totally unrelated, that he had some bond fraud issues with the Native American tribe. So you could take some of what he's saying perhaps with a grain of salt, but I'd say that's certainly some of the picture painted by his testimony.
Yeah. Let's move on to Ohio. So there's a fight over abortion that isn't a fight over abortion happening in Ohio. Explain this to us.
Yes, and I'm refreshing the returns right now, which I think it's been projected as a failure. So basically what the issue is, there was a state constitutional amendment that the Ohio legislature was putting forward, which had to be voted on by residents of the state, to essentially increase the threshold of citizen-led ballot initiatives to amend the Constitution. So in Ohio,
increase the threshold, how the number of people you had to get signed off?
Yes, so it was increasing the geographic width. So if you're a petitioner, you want to get something on the ballot for citizens to vote on for a constitutional amendment. Under the current rules in Ohio, you have to get a certain number of signatures. It's 5% of voters who voted in the last gubernatorial race of 44, exactly half of the state's 88 counties. This measure would increase it to all 88. So you'd have to get 5% in all 88 counties, and it would move the actual winning vote threshold from a simple majority to 60%.
Clarify for me. So the rule is you have to have 5%, and those 5% have to be spread out over at least those 44 counties, or you need 5% in each of those 44 counties?
My understanding is it has to be in each of those 44 counties.
Okay, so in each of those 44 counties, you would need 5% of the people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. And yes, this change would have made it in every county.
Yes, in addition to moving the total vote threshold for it to pass to 60%.
So the idea being they wanted to make it a lot harder to do citizen-led ballot initiatives.
Yes, and this picked up steam because earlier this year, pro-abortion groups started an initiative that will be on the ballot in November to add an abortion's rights protections into the Ohio Constitution. And Republican lawmakers, we don't really even have to infer this. They have literally said that this is an effort designed to try and prevent that November ballot initiative from passing and amending the Constitution.
So the failure of this change then would be a win for the abortion rights folks.
That's right. And because this was a pretty loosely veiled proxy battle over abortion, but it was still technically a procedural question. So there's lots of interesting outside groups that don't really have a dog in the fight per se, or traditionally might have a different dog in the fight when it comes to abortion, that voted one way or the other for totally different reasons. So the Ohio Fraternal Order of the Police, not exactly your progressive bastion, they endorsed Trump in 2020, came down on the side of the progressives who were against the constitutional amendment, but for a totally unrelated reason. They want to make sure that the vote threshold remains at 50% as a check against any right to work laws that the legislature might pass to reduce their union's collective bargaining powers. And there's other different permutations that people on different sides, business groups, et cetera. So there were some more.
They were pursuing progressive ends, just not the progressive end that the NARAL people were pursuing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there was lots of little interesting kind of wrinkles there, but it's been projected that that vote has failed. There's still a lot of the vote that has to be counted, but given the high volume of early voting that occurred, they have a month of early voting in Ohio. It seems like that issue 1 is what it was called has failed.
And do we think that it failed because there are North Korean intelligence operatives hacking into Venezuelan voting machines?
I don't think so. And I think the reason why we're getting these projections so clearly is that Ohio is pretty on top of counting and calculating their returns pretty quickly.
So Ohio's good at something. It's good to know. Why are they so on top of it?
I'm not sure exactly. I was honestly just talking with Declan and wondering, hey, how late are we gonna have to stay up for this thing? And
As late as it takes.
Yeah.
You're young. You'll live through it. All right. So Ohio is kind of a weird state politically because it used to be one of these sort of, I hate the red, blue, purple thing, but it was a very closely contested state very often for a long time. And then it seems to have taken a real turn to the right and toward the Republican side, at least as far as presidential elections go. But as we've seen in some other places that have a reputation for being conservative, or at least Republican, I'm thinking of Kansas, anti-abortion measures are not just flying through. And in fact, measures running counter to the anti-abortion agenda seem to be doing pretty well. So what's up with Ohio in that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things to consider here. One is that this effort was a pretty clearly identified as a changing the rules of the game while the game is being played, or at least that's what the one side, it seems like, successfully was able to paint it as, which you might get some support for that as a constitutional matter, even if people, moderates or independents, aren't as gung-ho about abortion issues as the progressives leading this fight were. But just the simple fact that it was kind of moving the goalpost in direct response to a specific constitutional amendment vote that was coming up might get you some more support. Another issue that's kind of documented in political science literature is a status quo bias when it comes to actually changing a constitution or other ballot initiatives that might affect state laws, but particularly constitutional issues. If a voter doesn't know exactly or isn't familiar with something that's on their ballot as like a vote yes or vote no on X issue, there is a little bit of a bias to just sticking with the status quo, which happened to be in favor of abortion advocates on this issue.
Are there other similar issues coming up in other states?
Yeah, no, this is kind of a part of a broader trend, largely in red states, of trying to work to curtail citizen-led initiatives, be that for constitutional amendments or just citizen-led referendums on state laws. There's been movement in North Dakota and South Dakota. Ohio seems to be the most one of the most stringent restrictions, in particular that geographic requirement requiring you to have signatures from every county. That's the most stringent of any other state of the 18 or so states that allow citizens to amend the Constitution via ballot initiative. So that might prompt some course correcting, perhaps, from some of these other state legislatures to do something a little more mild to increase the chances of it going through. But a lot of this is prompted by Dobbs, and a lot of the energy is prompted by Dobbs and those early defeats that you pointed out, like in Kentucky and Michigan, where either an abortion restriction was shot down, or in the case of Michigan, an abortion protection was enshrined. So yeah, this has been picking up steam, but it's got a pretty poor track record as a successful strategy for Republicans looking to ensure their state against progressives expanding abortion law.
Yeah. So when Dobbs was decided, my first thought was, it took us 50 years to get a chance to fight this out in the Democratic and political realm. It'll take another 50 years of fighting there before this issue is settled. Is that what you think?
I think so. Maybe and then some. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Good talking to you. We will move on again. Thank you so much. We have Mary is up, I think.
I'm here.
Hey, Mary, what's going on?
Nothing much. How about yourself?
You have a picture in the background of a person in a hat, it looks like, in a yellow suit. What's that all about?
I do. I quite like it. I'm a big fan of the color yellow. You can't quite see it, but she's also blowing a gum bubble. There's something kind of a nice, I don't know, something unorthodox about it. She's in a very nice yellow suit and blowing a big bubble. So try to live with that energy.
Good to know. So are the Chinese invading Alaska, or what's going on up there?
It's a great question. I'm sure the Alaskans are interested to know. Over the weekend, news broke that a flotilla, which is a very silly word for something that's otherwise rather serious, was
Flotilla a silly word?
It sounds silly.
It looks like it should be pronounced flotilla.
It does. It sounds like you should pronounce it like a Mexican flatbread. But instead it refers to a group of ships. And in this case, it was Russian and Chinese ships that were approaching the US territorial waters off the coast of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And so if you're not familiar with the geography of Alaska, that's that chain of islands that sort of looks a bit like a constellation. It's an archipelago. It's another silly word.
Great word.
Off the coast. It is a great word. It rolls off the tongue. So they were approaching U.S. territorial waters. U.S. territorial waters.
How close did they get?
So this is what we don't actually know. We know that the territorial waters are 12 miles off the coast of these islands. We know that they didn't breach that line, so they didn't get within 12 miles, according to the Pentagon. But the Pentagon also wouldn't say how close they got. So we don't know if they were 15 miles away or 12 and a half miles away from the islands. We just know that they got close enough that the U.S. Navy felt like they should be ushered away. And they were by 4 warships, American warships, and a jet for good measure. So
Good measure. A little political point here. You don't have to address this, but it just jumps out at me. So the U.S. government knows to a penny how much money I made last year, but they can't say to a mile how close the enemy armada was to our territorial waters. That seems to me disproportionate. Like maybe we haven't invested entirely in the right things, but
well, you would say that, wouldn't you, Kevin? I mean, it might be an issue of can't rather or won't rather than can't. For the peace of mind of the Alaskans. I don't know. So it's the public doesn't know. I should hope that the Pentagon knows. But yeah, unclear.
Yeah, they know how much fluid you're bringing onto an airplane. So this sort of stuff happens from time to time. You read about, the Chinese menacing the Taiwanese or the Russians rattling their sabers in various ways to other sorts of countries in their sphere. But we're not used to seeing too much of this with the United States, are we? Is this kind of normal stuff, or is this abnormal stuff? How should we think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 ways to sort of think about it, which is in comparison to what the Russians and the Chinese normally get up to, and then in comparison to the way that the U.S. Navy and other U.S. military personnel engage with the world. And so on the first point, what you have is, yes, the sort of typical saber rattling, but atypical in the sense of how close they got. And it's I think Mike Gallagher, the chairman of the House Select Committee on the CCP, called this brazen. He said this was a test of the United States, and so in one sense it's unique, sort of the degree to which they were willing to toe the line, literally. But if you are sort of a casual observer of the news, you might say, hey, the US floats ships through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea all the time. Why are the Chinese and the Russians conducting these exercises any different? And it's different for the reason that no one questions, at least no one serious questions whether or not Alaska belongs to us. And yet, in the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea, where, in the South China Sea in particular, China is sort of employing a finders keepers method to international waters, which is, hey, we put some sand on this reef, it's ours now, which means all of this is ours too around it, which the US has said, hey, you can't do that. And so every once in a while, the US will fly a plane or, float a ship through those areas, which are heavily trafficked by the world's commerce, to say, hey, we can do this and you can't stop us. And this is in accordance with international law. So I think the difference here is really the message that we're trying to send and the context, which is no one questions whether or not Alaska belongs to us, but a lot of people question whether the mound of sand with a tank on it in the South China Sea belongs to China. And trying to reinforce that point is kind of where the difference lies.
Have we seen any balloons recently?
Not recently. That was very early on in my tenure at the Dispatch, and it was what a way to come in with the spy balloon. But just because we haven't seen spy balloons doesn't mean that the Chinese Communist Party has not been getting up to other nefarious activities. Last week, the Department of Justice indicted 2 U.S. sailors for spying for the Chinese in exchange for money. And so they were 2 sailors in their 20s based in California. They were 2 separate indictments. So they're not alleging that the 2 sailors collaborated, but they were both guilty, the DOJ alleges, of handing Chinese intelligence information about, in one case, an amphibious attack ship, the USS Essex. So more than 50 mechanical manuals and technical manuals about this ship. And in another case, a sailor stationed on a base in California handed his handler photographs of the plans for a massive U.S. training mission in the Indo-Pacific, exercises in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the plans for the blueprints for a radar system that is on a military base in Okinawa, Japan. So, you sort of ask, like, what can, stuff. Yeah, right. Like, what can a 22-year-old and a 26-year-old sailor tell Chinese intelligence? A lot, actually. And I was talking to a source who was formerly in the intelligence community, who says, listen, even if they're not handing over physical copies of plans and blueprints and, the sort of, Mission Impossible stuff that you think about when you think about spies, just telling an intelligence officer what your day looks like, what drills look like in the case of an emergency, things that you might not think are actually useful information can be useful to someone who is familiar with these ships, familiar with how militaries work, and is trying to piece together vulnerabilities in these cases.
Do we know how much money they got?
So in one case we do. The indictment says that the sailor who was stationed not on the ship, but at a base, was given something around $14,000 for this. And
Can't
the
even
others,
buy Honda Civic. You
I
can't buy
know.
half a Honda Civic with $14,000.
right, you're looking at like a 15 or 20-year-old lemon at that point with that kind of money.
This guy's going to get dropped down like the deepest, darkest oubliette the federal government has to offer.
Yep.
And then there's a fun word, by the way, better than
And French word.
the nefarious flotilla in your archipelago. For $14,000?
Yeah, and we know that the other sailor who was posted to the USS Essex was given thousands of dollars, and we don't know whether that's tens or hundreds of thousands, but thousands of dollars in any event. And the indictment did not specify exactly how much he was paid to betray his country.
So the Russians and the Chinese a while back, a question from a reader here, signed this joint statement of eternal friendship and comradeship and such. Is this the fruit of that poison tree? Is this an indicator of their newly invigorated alliance, or is this a one-off, or how should we think about it?
No, this is, and it's something that has been ongoing. There were similar, if I'm not mistaken, that alliance was signed right before Russia invaded Ukraine. So obviously their support extends to wanton and unjustified invasions of neighbors. And they had a similar patrol mission, joint patrol mission with fewer ships last year, almost a year ago, which was met with only a Coast Guard cutter, which is a small ship, I understand. And this time they were met with much more firepower as an inducement to kindly leave the neighborhood. But this is something that Russia and China are getting up to. They've also done trilateral exercises with South Africa, who has sort of played both sides against the middle in this sort of Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan conflict that's brewing, at least in China's case. So yes, it is, in short, it is a pattern and not a one-off.
See, every time you use the word trilateral, the ghost of Lyndon LaRouche looks around a little bit, I think, but that's some 1970s conspiracy theory humor that's probably about 40 years before your time. So never mind that. So we got the Chinese, we got the Russians, but let's talk about the real enemy, which is the United States credit.
Right.
Our guys over at Fitch took a look at the US books and situation, went, nah, we're not buying your story. They gave them a little bit of a notch of a downgrade. The Biden administration kind of flew into a rage over this a little bit. Like, I mean, it's hard to tell when Janet Yellen's really upset. This is totally unjustified and based on outdated data. And outdated data is what she says when she's really mad about something. What's the deal?
Yeah, I mean, Fitch basically did what your credit card company would do if you said, I'm going to keep spending money on this card and I'm not going to get another job to raise my income to pay it off. But don't worry about it. I'm good for it. And Fitch said, I'm pretty sure you're still good for it, but I'm less sure than I was yesterday. And so they dropped the US credit rating down just a little bit to it's no longer perfect. It's AA instead of AAA. S&P, Standard and Poor's, which all of these credit rating agencies sound like characters in a Dickens novel. There's Moody's, there's Standard and Poor's, and Fitch, and so those are the big three. Moody's is now the only one that has the U.S. credit rating at perfect, and so it'll be closely watched to see whether that holds in the next few months.
Any practical results from this?
I mean, one can hope that Congress, looking at this scolding from one of the three major credit rating agencies in the United States, would say, hey, maybe they're onto something. Maybe we have have behaved badly with the United States taxpayers' money. But alas, they did not. They pointed fingers at each other for behaving irresponsibly. So we had the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee saying, hey, this is Biden's fault. Look at how much money he wants to spend. And he didn't engage with Republicans way back at the beginning of the most recent fight about the debt ceiling.
The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee thinks that the president appropriates money.
I mean, you're asking the hard questions there, Kevin. You're asking the hard.
Explain to him what he does for a living yet.
Yeah.
If only the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee
could do something about this massive problem.
Had some ways or means to address it. That would be wonderful.
Yep. And in kind, the White House responded no to House and Senate Republicans. This is your fault for playing footsie with default in the last fight over the debt ceiling. So, there out of that fight came a little bit of a promise to lower spending. There were spending caps put in place, which, even Senate Republicans and others are already straining against, especially when it comes to, funding more aid to Ukraine, for example. But if you are not going to cut spending, then you have to raise taxes, and they're not going to do that either. So it is, as I said, as if you told your credit card company, I'm good for it, I promise.
American Express, if you were listening, I'm good for it. I promise. Don't come after me just yet. It'll get taken care of very, very soon. I'm sure. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I appreciate your insights. Fun conversation. Thank you all, members of our community. We appreciate you being here. We could not do the things that we do without you. Please spread the word. Let your friends know that there is quality journalism out there that they can pay for. Because the alternative is to look at ads for stuff you don't really want to look at ads for too much. And remember, if you're not the customer, you're the product. So thank you all for joining us, and we will talk to you next time. I'm going to stare awkwardly at you now until the feed cuts out.